Well, I think I have made allowance for the coffee, and you have had time to consider the ballot paper, so we can move into the questions, if you have any, and the feedback, if you have any. And what I propose to do on this occasion, because it's reasonably simple, I propose to go by question, and I will ask whether there are any issues in relation to the questions, any questions in relation to the questions, any suggestions in relation to the questions, and you can put your hand up and we'll hear. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with question 1. Quite a few hands up. We'll yeah, all right.
So the suggestion from the citizens at this table is for the question to be made more neutral. This feels maybe it's slightly suggestive.
How would you suggest that? What have you in mind?
That there should be an initial question as to whether there should or shouldn't be. Just as to whether there should or shouldn't be an initial question as to whether there should or shouldn't be a change before discussing whatever the change might be. There's a suggestion that the wording in this almost invites a positive response to a change.
All right, yeah. What do the experts think of that?
Would it make any difference if the question was changed so that there was 2 statements and you could pick one statement? One is that fixed-term parliaments should be introduced, and then another statement which says fixed-term parliaments should not be introduced, and then you tick one box. Would that get at your concern?
That absolutely would be an option. An alternative option would be, should the current situation change?
Yeah.
And that's a yes or no. And then if that's a yes, is it semi or fixed?
So
If the first question is, should the current situation change, that's just wide open, and that's just a simple yes or no, and then you advance from there.
Yeah. Anybody else have a view on that? Maybe question. Yeah.
Thank you, Judge. Citizens at this table had the same view, that the first question should be, do you want to leave the system as it is? And that further, that the result of that should be known before progressing to the next questions.
Yeah.
Table 13.
Yes, we'll go to table 13 now.
Judge, I'm a citizen at table 13. My question relates to the way the ballot paper is laid out, and to know if your final report when it would be written, would it, if the answer to question 1 was no, would that be the end of what you would write on your report? And similarly, if you get down to question 3, if it was option 1, because if the answer to question 1 is no, then any recommendations for something else after that would seem totally irrelevant. And likewise, if you go down to option 1 and the majority opt for a fixed term, then any options in relation to dissolving the Dáil would be irrelevant again. So will your report, if the answers to question 1 is no, or question 3 is option 1, will your report end at that? Because if it didn't, then the ballot should be taken separately.
I'll hear the experts on that. I mean, I think what we presented and what I said in the explanation was that one question wasn't dependent on another. But I'll hear what the experts have to say on that. We'll hear each of you. Yeah. Oren, yeah.
So I think it's a fair question. It doesn't seem to me, that it's necessarily irrelevant, in that the Oireachtas has asked you to look at this issue and will consider your recommendations. And it may be that the Oireachtas say that you were to vote no to question 1. So the Oireachtas would know that you didn't think there should be fixed-term parliaments, but the Oireachtas committee or the Oireachtas decides that nevertheless they want to explore the issue further. And in that context, it might be relevant for them to know what you think should happen if the issue has been considered further, even though you didn't want the issue to be considered further. So it's not necessarily irrelevant or illogical to be getting answers and recommendations into questions 2, 3 and 4, irrespective of what the answer is to question 1. But that doesn't mean it has to be that way either. You might want to construct it in a way so that the Oireachtas won't find out what you think about the other elements of the questionnaire, depending on what you answer the first question.
And John, what would you?
Just echo what Oren has just said. I think there's very valuable information that can come out of this deliberation that's independent of the first question, because who knows what the Oireachtas might do in a few years' time. Might disagree with you on the first question, but belt ahead. And if it didn't have information about what you thought about it in a more nuanced way, it would say, sure, they didn't tell us anything, should we do what we want? So I think it is still useful, although I take the point.
Yeah. Robert, do you have a view?
No, I mean, I agree, but so I was involved in the last one. I seem to remember even on the last one there was a question where it depended on what your answer was to one question as to what was before. So it was people, but you were still asked the question, the second question. So I mean,
it was a different scenario. Just if I may make the observation that this particular topic that we're given it in very, very broad terms, and without any indication of what they were looking for, to be utterly frank about it. And I'm of the same view as the experts, that even if the answer to question 1 is no, it may be relevant that in the future that the information provided in the other questions is available to the Oireachtas. So I don't know how you feel about that, but that's the approach we adopted in relation to the structure of the ballot paper. Yes, I guess we're still on question 1, yeah? Yeah.
I'm the facilitator at table 11. The citizens at this table are suggesting in relation to question 1 that it be explicitly stated that if you're ticking the box no, that this means that there be no change to the current status.
Yeah, well, it's the same point, and it's just a question of how one puts it in. I think perhaps when we go through all of the questions, we'll rise and have a short discussion about it. Yeah, I think that's the better way of dealing with it. Still on question 1? Yes.
Table 4 here first, maybe. Just
table.
They have the mic here already.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Rhonda.
Judge, one of the citizens at table 4 wants the question divided into 2. So you have, do you think that fixed term parliaments for Dáil Éireann and Seanad Éireann should be introduced? And then the second one would be for semi-fixed. Do you think that semi-fixed parliaments for Dáil Éireann and Seanad Éireann should be introduced, yes or no?
Yeah.
That's question 3.
Yeah. Yeah, I just let the experts answer that. Would anybody?
I'm trying to capture that with question 3, really. So
Yes.
Question 1 is really do you want to change or not? So that's the status quo or not status quo. And then understanding that you might vote no. Question 3 is then, well, if you do want to change, what type of change do you want? Absolutely fixed or semi-fixed?
We gave some thought to the words in brackets after fixed term parliament, because the object of putting the words in brackets there is to indicate that we have in mind 2 different types of fixed term parliament, the absolutely fixed and the semi-fixed.
Liam, just take the mic.
In question 1, you're giving people the option essentially of fixed or semi-fixed, and then trying to force them into a yes/no answer. You can't give I don't feel you can give an option. And then just do a yes/no on it.
That's your reading of the question, and it's understandable that is your reading of the question because of the word whether. And or. And we discussed this at length. I take your point. Maybe we should have another.
Yeah. I think this point will be ironed out if we take on board the original suggestion from table 1. I think it will become obsolete.
Yeah. I had an idea of the words in brackets commencing being absolutely fixed or semi-fixed.
Yeah.
I didn't win, obviously.
Oh, yes, yeah, okay.
Yeah, table 2.
Judge, I think question 1 works fine, because if you don't want to change from the flexible system, you can vote no. But you should still, the format still works, because if you still want to change whose approval is needed, you can still vote for that to be changed.
Yeah.
So you can vote for fixed or semi-fixed, and you can also vote for flexible in the first question, and then by continuing on, it allows you to then stay flexible but change who has approval. So personally, I think it works.
Yeah.
Table 12.
Very good. Are we still on question 1? Yeah. Table 6.
12.
Oh, sorry, 12. Sorry.
Still on question 1, one of the citizens at the table would like to see the question stated more clearly, something like, should we retain the status quo, and have it as a yes or no answer?
Yeah.
Hi, sorry. I'm a citizen from table 6. I would like to see question 1 read, do you think that the current situation regarding the term of Irish parliaments should be changed or not changed? Or should be changed, yes or no?
Yeah.
And then that would get rid of what you want it to be. It would just be a simple question, like others said. And then question 3 wouldn't be irrelevant.
Wouldn't?
You know, sorry, like, so do you think that the current situation regarding the terms of Irish parliaments should be changed?
Yeah.
Or something to that so that it's irrelevant what it's changed to, whether it be fixed or semi-fixed, that's just taken out. Do you think that it should be changed?
Yeah.
Question 1. And then possibly following on from that, you could put question 3. Instead of splitting question 1, just take out some of question 1 and immediately following it, put question 3.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're in agreement that we have to change question 1.
Yeah, we are in agreement. I think everybody's in agreement that we need to change question 1 to make it absolutely clear what this is all about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we just move on to question 2 then.
All right. Does anybody else want to say anything about question 1? All right. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Can we have the result of question 1 after the vote on question 1?
I mean, what you're talking there is a sequential ballot like we did on the 8th Amendment, and that's very difficult. It's very time consuming, because what you would be required to do is have register, do one set of votes, do a full count, wait for that count, then get the results, and then decide whether
I'm perfectly acceptable with a show of hands.
Yeah.
I just feel the question, when you're asking question 1 and you get a result, asking question 2, 3 and 4 is undermining question 1.
Yeah, except what the expert said, and with which I agree, that...
but even having question 2, 3 and 4 on the ballot paper, to me undermines question 1. Because you're being asked, do you want to change or no change?
Yeah.
And you're saying to yourself, no, I don't want any change. And oh, by the way, I want to have the cabinet, I want to have somebody else deciding. I want the Citizens' Assembly, their opinion on the change I want. Which I think is academic, because you've already decided you don't want to change. And you're perfectly happy with the system that it is. As I said at the table, he has 2 powers. One to be call an election, the other is to have cabinet members. That's it.
Would the experts like to say anything on that?
Yep. Okay. So I see the concern 1, and I think one thing we used when we were thinking through this in relation to the 8th Amendment was in subsequent questions there would be an option not to state an opinion, so that at least you didn't feel compelled to say yes or no to a question where like you thought that you shouldn't have to consider that question because of what you said earlier, so that people who thought that there shouldn't be any change to the 8th Amendment weren't then forced into a situation where they had to sign up for a particular type of change. So we could do that, okay? And I think it'd probably be a good idea to do that. beyond that, we're back to the earlier question, in that it's the Oireachtas that has asked to look at this, and the Oireachtas might be interested in what the citizens as a whole of the Assembly think should happen in terms of details of a fixed-term Parliament thing, even if the citizens think in principle fixed-term Parliaments shouldn't be introduced. So that's why that approach is taken.
John, yes?
I'd be inclined to stick with it as it is, to be perfectly honest. I don't think question 3 necessarily would undermine question 1 if question 1 went against, because question 3 says, in the event that fixed-term parliaments were introduced, it doesn't say if the Citizens' Assembly recommended. And I think, therefore, this could inform how parliamentarians down the line, if it came up, they could gain information from this. And I think my own view would be you'd risk losing an awful lot of potentially valuable information if you just kept a yea or nay. But
yeah.
And we say, what we're saying is, we agree with the present system in all its failings. And then you're saying in the next breath, by the way, you don't want to change, but by the way, what's your opinion on fixed or non-fixed Parliament? You're like asking me a question and you're getting me answer, but you're not happy with the answer, you're not happy with the question, but you want further questions.
I'm not unhappy.
No, if you ask the fourth question first, I'd give that'd be a nice way of putting it. I wouldn't know question 1 was now question 4, so I'd be caught. But the mistake you made was you asked question 1 first. Do you want to change or do you not want to change? And the consensus is, no, I don't want to change. No, it's a nice academic exercise to talk about fixed parliaments and non-fixed parliaments. Like the 8th Amendment, as you said, what was agreed was, it wasn't that we know we'll have abortion or we won't have abortion. We'll cancel the 8th Amendment. And then we'll decide after that what we're going to do. And the argument now going on is it right or is it wrong? But the referendum basically is to cancel the 8th Amendment. It's not abortion or non-abortion.
So there's no reason why that can't be an option as to how the ballot paper is constructed. So you've made your view, other people have made views that are similar to that, and that can be a choice perhaps that is made as to whether there should be one question, whether we should do it that way.
A potential option is that you could leave the 4 questions or whatever number you ultimately decide on the ballot paper, but the room could the views of the room could be determined as to whether, in the event that the members vote no for the first question, in other words, they vote for the status quo to remain, that the remaining results are not reported, and that the results of the Assembly is just on that one question. And we could ask the room's views on that. Now, they might not all agree with the citizen at table 2, but we could, we could determine that by a majority in the room.
Or that if you voted no in relation to question 1, that you wouldn't have an option of voting in relation to the others, the later. That's another possibility. Oren.
That wouldn't capture people who want to keep this current system that is flexible. Flexible terms.
Val, can you wait for that?
That wouldn't capture the people who want to keep a flexible term, but want to then change the power of the Taoiseach. If you say no to the first question, right, that means you want to keep it flexible. And then if you're saying, well, no, you can't answer the other questions, well, then you don't have a choice on saying, well, I don't agree with the Taoiseach being able to call for an election. I want to change that so it's a parliament or a majority or a supermajority. Do you get my point?
We just, there's another.
Thanks. Just in terms of making question, or the way question 1 leads into the rest of the ballot paper more favourable to some people, would it be better to... Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Do you want me to stand up? In terms of making the way question 1 leads into the rest of the ballot paper more favourable, should we put prefer not to state an opinion on subsequent questions? Does that... What, I don't know.
I mean, I think perhaps what we should do is move on to consider the other questions and consider this structural issue more fundamentally when we break to discuss how we're going to reconfigure the wording of question 1 in any event.
Is there any other observation on that question? Yeah, there is obviously. Table 14. Table 14.
How are we doing, Dave? Table 14. We're losing the run of ourselves again. These are for recommendations. For the ballot paper, the question 1, do you think fixed term parliaments, whether absolutely fixed or semi-fixed for Dáil Éireann and Shannon Éireann, should be introduced, is self-explanatory in itself. Now you can word it, change it around that it says, do you think the status quo should stay the same? Do you think that we should change it? It's still opting for a change. I think a simple show of hands around the room, if everybody's happy, the majority is happy with that question, regardless of whether you actually want to vote yes or no to the answer. But show of hands around the room just to move it on, because we're just losing the run of ourselves over nothing.
Yeah, all right, yeah. And does somebody else have a... Yes.
I just feel as though we didn't give up our whole weekend to answer one question. We should get all the information we can for the Oireachtas while we're all here. And whether you agree with things or not, we have to have the consensus that we're all allowed to answer all the questions however way we see fit. And let's just move on.
Yeah, all right. So, will we leave it over and consider it? We'll consider it, and I mean, I take on board what was suggested about a show of hands. We'll come back to that later. So we'll move on to question 2. And you see, have we question 2 up?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Table 9.
Table 9. Yes.
I'm the facilitator for Table 9. This option has been mentioned already, but a citizen at this table would like to see a no opinion option for 2, 3 and 4.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And any observations on question 2? We've been a bit arbitrary, I know, by just putting in 4 years and 5 years. Yeah.
14, yeah.
Sorry, and a citizen at table 14 would like me to comment just on question 1, just to make it clear.
We're on question 2 now, yeah.
As it relates to the rest of the questions, sorry.
I was just saying that if you did happen to vote no on the first question, that even if you didn't agree with the result, you would still have an input into what would happen if the yes vote won.
Yeah.
And I think that's important that everybody fills in, even if they voted no initially to number 1 question, that they would still have an input into the rest of the questions and more for the Oireachtas to contemplate.
Yeah. But there are 2 views on that. Some people want to and some people don't. Yeah, so we'll have to deal with that. Anything on question 2, anything specific in relation to question 2? Oh yes, there's
So it might be a bit abstract to deal with on the ballot paper, but in question 2 we're talking about the length of the term.
Yes.
Would it be acceptable to put to the Assembly the idea of having a minimum fixed term for Parliament, just in the examples from this morning? So we could have a minimum fixed term of 3 years, and then after that it's a semi-fixed Parliament.
Yeah.
Just as a question to put onto the draft ballot paper. If it's too abstract to go onto the ballot paper, that's okay too.
Very good. We'll consider that. Anything else? Any other issue in relation to question 2? All right. We'll move on to question 3 then, which is a fairly straightforward question.
Table 1.
Yeah, table 1.
Just one of the citizens at table 1 had 2 queries around question 3. The first being, how would the conditions be determined? And then secondly, what would the implementation process be, whether it be constitutional or legislative?
Now, question 3? Yeah.
So I think you're into the realm of just implementation questions that can probably be left over to the Oireachtas Committee.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
if there is to be a change following on from question 1, it can only happen through a referendum.
Yeah, yeah.
Then you could have questions, do you include in the referendum what sort of change it is, or does the referendum authorise legislation to allow change? But that seems to be at a level of sort of not micromanagement of the detail, but far more detailed than this group has to go, I think.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, and Owen Daly said it this morning. If there was a change, a constitutional change, there would have to be a referendum. Anything else on question 3? Question 4. Yes.
One suggestion in relation to question 4 from the citizens at this table 11, the addition of E, the Taoiseach.
So I think the reason why the Taoiseach was not included was because this is assuming a semi-fixed parliament. So in other words, it is changing the status quo, and at the moment it's just the Taoiseach. So it would be, the logic is that the Taoiseach is already involved in one sense, and this is what additional factors do you want? And also I think the logic of the cabinet there is that it's that the Taoiseach is part of the cabinet, is involved in the cabinet. So the Taoiseach is assumed and included, therefore it wouldn't be separate.
Well, perhaps we could change the wording of the question, say, whose approval apart from the Taoiseach? Would that, do you think, would that be all right, that wording? Or other than the Taoiseach? We might give some thought to that. Yeah. Give some thought. Table 5, yes.
The citizen of this table would like to make a proposal to adjust the wording of question 4 for the second part of it there after the comma. Whose approval does the Taoiseach need for an early general election to be held? And they also have a recommendation for another category E, and I don't have precise wording, but the question they would like to pose is, should there not be an option to include a role for Shannon Éireann as well as Dáil Éireann to approve an early general election?
Yeah. That gives some food for thought, yeah. Would you have any views on it at this stage?
I think, anything can be included. Probably why it hadn't occurred to us to include it was that the Seanad is not the source of democratic authority in the Constitution, so the electorate is very limited. 11 of the members are appointed by the Taoiseach, then university graduates, and then politicians vote for the rest. So to allow, it's not an argument against the Seanad, but it's a body that doesn't really have a democratic mandate, and to allow a body without a democratic mandate in that sense to prevent the holding of a general election was just not something that had occurred to us. So that's not a reason why it can't be put on the ballot paper, but it was a reason why it hadn't occurred to us to put it on the ballot paper.
Yeah. But we consider it. We consider it. Table 3. Sorry.
Good afternoon, Judge. I'm the facilitator for the citizens at table number 3. There are just 2 minor amendments to question 4. One of them has already been addressed by another table. The remaining outstanding matter is regarding the option C, a supermajority of Dáil Éireann, e.g. 2/3. The citizens just wanted clarity that that should be the overall number of TDs rather than the attending TDs on the day of the vote.
Well, we haven't clarified that, and sort of we stepped back from it. I have to be honest, didn't we? Yeah, yeah.
I think we thought that that might be better something left vague, because you might have then people who want two different options. You might have to have an option for people who want us 2/3 of TDs voting and people who want us 2/3 of members actually there, and that seemed an unnecessary extension of the list. But again, there's no, that's why it wasn't there, but not a reason why it has to stay out.
Yeah. But
Just note, I think it was the general consensus of everyone at the table. They would have preferred the overall number, just giving input. Yeah.
That if it clarified it and it said that it meant a majority of the members of the Dáil in B, and again the supermajority in C would relate to the members of the Dáil as distinct from those who voted.
Correct. It was a general consensus of everyone at the table.
Yeah, we'll bear that in mind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's to remove the abstention issue, is it? It's to remove the abstention issue, that's why, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Thank you, George. I'm the facilitator for table number 6. Some of the members at the table wanted to change question 4, so they wanted the first part of the question to be removed. So in the event that semi-fixed town parliaments for Dáil Éireann or Shannon Éireann were introduced, that part would be removed, and the question would read, whose approval should be needed for an early general election to be held? It was secondary to that a member had suggested possibly to move question 4 into the place of question 2.
Say that again.
So some of the citizens wanted to delete the first part of the question.
Yeah.
So if everything before the comma would be removed, and the question would read, whose approval should be needed for an early general election to be held? Yeah. And then a member had also suggested that they wanted to move question 4 into the place of question 2.
All right. Well, if we were to remove the first part of it, it would complicate the problem in relation to the relationship with question 1, wouldn't it? Would anybody like to comment on that?
Sorry, just as a one of the citizens would like to speak to explain fully what the reasoning is behind that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It's just through the discussions it came to light at the table that while some of us might like for the current term of the parliaments in Ireland to stay the same, so to be the flexible up to 5 years after the first meeting, for that to stay the same, but we may like the opportunity to change who would be responsible for calling said general election. So instead of having a question 1A and a question 1B reading this question without the first line, and having a fourth question at the end reading the exact same, that possibly move them all down, and either in question 1 or question 2 have a general question not related to each other, that whether you vote yes or no to question 1, you can answer this question without it being in connection to question 1 at all. So if you want to change to fixed or semi-permanent, or you want it to keep it the same, you can answer to this question who you want to be in charge of calling the election.
Well, that would be necessitate a change of the status quo, necessitate a referendum, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you want the cabinet, say you take the first half of the question away, so there's no implication of the introduction of a fixed-term parliament. If you wanted the cabinet, say, to be or a supermajority or whatever, to be introduced as part of a check, if you like, that would necessitate a constitutional amendment and would effectively introduce a semi-fixed term parliament. So you would end up with where you are in the first part of the question as it already stands. See what I mean? So in other words, you couldn't just, maybe you could pass a law, or will tell us, but I mean, it seems to me it wouldn't necessitate
there would have to be a constitutional amendment, and I think then the political scientists, once the amendment was passed, and if you needed the approval of any of these additional bodies, it would then constitute, in just political science terms, there's no legal significance to it, but it would then be a semi-fixed term parliamentary system, because it was no longer the sole right of the Taoiseach to dissolve the Dáil.
Yeah, so if you want more checks, you should probably be voting for the semi-fixed term when that comes up earlier on in the questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything else on question 4? Yeah. Table 2.
Thank you, Judge. It was the same point was being made by the citizen, a number of citizens at this table.
Yeah, very
so
good.
it's the same point.
Yeah, and I think, question table 1.
Judge, just one of the citizens at this table had a question around if both B and C is marked yes, how will you differentiate? Should it maybe be an either B or C option? And then the second point, that maybe the question could be split into A, that you choose the actors, and then B, you vote on the majorities.
So,
yeah.
I think what we thought in terms of B and C, so each one as it's presented would be a separate recommendation. And obviously, if you're in favour of C, you would be in favour of B as well, because you think it should happen with a supermajority, you think there would have to be a majority. So you would just vote yes to both of those. If you thought it should just be a majority and not a supermajority, you'd vote yes to B and no to C. And I don't think there's any difficulty then in understanding what people have voted for through that. I think that would be clear, but that hopefully helps.
Any other questions in relation to 4?
Thanks. So I was recommending the idea would be question 4, part 2, and it's around voting on the constraints, or we'd make recommendations for what can cause the dissolution of the doll. Dr. Schlieder gives examples of this, paragraph 3 of her paper and slide 2 of her presentation. And for an example she gives is not in the last 6 months of the president's term, but for us to make recommendations on constraints around the dissolution of a semi-fixed term parliament.
Would you like to comment on that, because it's something we have discussed? I mean, our function isn't to write legislation here. I think that's important to get that across.
I think we thought that with just the the morning's papers and the limited time to consider it, that it might make sense to limit question 4 to thinking about which political actors should be involved.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean, it's certainly not a complete system for the regulation of fixed term parliaments.
Yeah.
Your report, well, whatever it says, will go on to the Oireachtas committee, and as you've seen from that process on other recommendations, they have more resources to be able to think through detailed implementation issues like that. So there's a lot of technical issues that would have to be resolved that aren't addressed here, but we felt that this probably went as far as it should go given the amount of time you've had to consider things.
Yeah.
Well, that was
because
the thinking.
if we were to go that route, we would have to consider all of the circumstances in which all or some of the actors could halt or could allow a general election.
Thank you, Judge. Citizen at table 2 has asked for clarification. If you remove the top line as it appears on the screen there, and you go, whose approval is needed for an early general election to be held, why is it become a semi-fixed as opposed to the current flexible system, but just changing it to reflect a new roles for those stakeholders?
Because I guess the way in which we as political scientists understand the term semi-fixed is that it's not just one person, Taoiseach, who can make the decision. It's a number of people. So introducing the cabinet, so Taoiseach is part of the cabinet, but making that a collective decision would necessitate a change in the constitution, and therefore that would make the constraints greater. So that would place the system into the category of a semi-fixed term, as opposed to just a legislature that can be dissolved by the Taoiseach alone. So it's maybe partly a function of the terminology that's being used here, but the way in which a semi-fixed term parliament is being defined, the way in which Professor Schleiter presented a semi-fixed term parliament, she presented it as really Norway being the only fixed, absolutely fixed term parliament, and apart from the cases like Australia, like Ireland, that was complete discretion of the Prime Minister or the Taoiseach, All of the rest were semi-fixed, and that was a huge spectrum. It can involve the president, it can involve the legislature, it can involve the cabinet, it can involve all sorts of actors, and all of those come under what we would class as semi-fixed. So introducing the cabinet here, for example, would make it a semi-fixed parliament, but a semi-fixed parliament of the type where only the cabinet was involved, the Taoiseach and the cabinet was involved. You could have another version where the Taoiseach and the cabinet and the president, or the Taoiseach and the cabinet and a supermajority. In other words, all of these are different options under that very large sort of range of semi-fixed parliament options that there are.
Yeah, and I think I'm correct in saying if there was to be an absolutely fixed term parliament, i.e. one that cannot be cut short, that would be in the Constitution. The Constitution would say, in unequivocal terms, the term of Dáil Éireann is 5 years, full stop. Am I right in that? Yeah. So that would be a constitutional provision.
And under no circumstances would there be anything other than 5 years or whatever the term was. There would be no circumstances.
No circumstances. Cannot be cut short. That's why we use that terminology just to get the message across. Yeah. Yes.
John, citizen table now. Just a query: have we made it? Are we going to make a decision on whether we're going to have 1 or 2 ballot papers, or?
Yeah, we're going to rise and discuss it, and then we're going to come back, and you're going to decide it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So if there isn't anything else.
I have 2 questions. One, from the wording of question 4, the second part says, whose approval should be needed for an early general election to be held? And for me, it's not clear. It sounds like the decision to call an early general election has already been made in this case, so it was the Taoiseach's idea, and A, B, C, and D are the players who get to, or the actors who get to approve it. I'm wondering, is that true? And the second part of my question is, if I was to answer question 4, no to A, B, C, and yes to D, would that be the exact same situation as that we have currently? And is that still semi-fixed or fully flexible?
It is a good question, yeah.
So in the last, the answer to the last bit of that question is that in some senses, Ireland has a semi-fixed parliament because the president, of some circumstances, one particular circumstance, has a certain power. So if you remember Professor Schleiter's in your book, her table, Norway was the only one without any constraint whatsoever. Now, I think we're getting into maybe too arcane a discussion about what fixed term and semi-fixed term means, especially when we as political scientists exist in our little bubble and we just give this thing a label, semi-fixed, which isn't out there in normal currency of conversation. So if you were to go no, yes for D, then I think the logic would be that it would be up to the Oireachtas to decide how to interpret that, how to follow up on that. It would be consistent, I think, with the, I'm open to being contradicted here, but I think that would be consistent with the current situation. But it could also imply a different situation as well, where the president had a greater role, if you like. So there is some ambiguity in what that would mean in terms of the answer.
Yeah.
So I hadn't thought it was ambiguous, but that means it is ambiguous, I suppose. I thought it would mean that the president's approval would always be necessary, and the president could refuse permission, even if the Taoiseach still had the support of the majority of the Dáil. So we maybe need to, if we have a different understanding of that, clearly there's an issue.
I think that's what I think that's what we're implying, but maybe we need to think about the wording just to make that clear.
Yes.
The citizens at this table have a suggestion for a question 5. Which is, do you wish the opposition to be able to dissolve the Dáil by a simple majority? Yes or no?
Do you wish the opposition to be able to dissolve the Dáil?
By a simple majority, yes or no?
Yeah.
lost the confidence, that it's basically taken the president's power away.
Yeah.
In that situation, a simple majority, that's not an absolute majority, so that's a majority of those present. So that's no different from now. So that would just taken the president's power to refuse the solution. So, having not quite phoned a friend, but I think what we understand the implication of that to be is that, so by a simple majority, so that's not an absolute majority, which would be 50% plus one, which is constitutional change, nor a supermajority. So a simple majority would effectively be just the people who are voting, which is the current situation. So if the opposition does then pass a motion of no confidence in the Taoiseach and the government, and the government in that sense is brought down, then normally that would lead to a dissolution. I suppose it could, maybe the Taoiseach could go to the president and say, well, I've been brought down on this, but if there was another vote, maybe I'd survive. But I think really what the implication of this is that it would be taking away any right of the president to refuse a dissolution.
And there's also the issue that if the opposition now have a majority, are they any longer the opposition? So the opposition doesn't have a formal definition in Irish constitutional law or practice. So there's a possibility that that might already be captured by option B, which is a majority of Dáil Éireann can dissolve, can hold a general election, which is already covered as a question.
Yeah.
Alan, can you just wait for the mic, please?
Sorry, I think the purpose of asking the question is if you go for a supermajority, i.e. 2/3, so for example, the current government decides they want to dissolve and look for a new election, they look, the benchmark or the threshold that they have to reach would have to go, which is what the English system does, would have to go to 2/3, because it's a higher threshold rather than a simple government majority or simple Dáil majority. But if the opposition decides they don't like what's happening and then they go for it, the threshold of 2/3 for them would be very hard, whereas a threshold of a simple majority would be reflective of of the opinion of the Dáil at that point.
But I think we have to bear in mind what we've been asked to make recommendations on, and it is fixed term parliaments. It's not about amendments or variations to the current system. It's fixed term parliaments, and what we have tried to encompass in questions 3 and 4 are situations in which fixed term parliaments were introduced, and that's why I think it's important that the introductory words in both questions 3 and 4 stand. We're only concerned, we're not concerned with voting arrangements in place currently. We're concerned with whether there should be fixed term parliaments, and in broad terms when the circumstances in which, or the actors who should have a say in introducing them. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think there's just issue. I think it's possibly an issue of when we're starting to combine the different options. So what I think you're suggesting is that it could be, the Dáil could be dissolvable with a combination of A and C. So if the Cabinet want it and a supermajority if the Dáil want it, that's okay. But you would also like to be able to have a majority of the Dáil, provided it doesn't involve the government, which would be a lot more difficult to construct, I think, in terms of working that out. But we did give some thought as to whether we could present a list of combinations, because I think if you're going to start providing combinations of these, you probably have to consider every combination, and I think out of these 4 you would get to 14, and we think that would dilute the collective view of the Assembly, because it's likely the one that was chosen by the most people might only have been chosen by 10 or 12 of you or something like that, given the dilution of the vote across the board. So we were thinking that just keeping it relatively simple, bearing in mind that that isn't designing a complete picture, but is a steer to the Oireachtas that if you collectively think that there should be fixed term or semi-fixed term parliaments, that these are the sorts of actors that should be involved, and leaving it at that and let somebody else sort of take that and run with that as an idea rather than trying to design it in any more detail than that. And I appreciate that that leaves all sorts of questions unopened, unanswered, and it leaves a range of possibilities not considered, but we did have a sense that it might be getting towards the limits of what can be achieved today.
Yes. Yeah.
All of the citizens at table 8 would like a question added to read roughly as follows. In the event that semi-fixed term parliaments were introduced, making dissolution possible under specific circumstances as follows. A, collapse of government, yes or no. B, failed government formation within 30 days, yes or no. And C, failure to pass a budget, yes or no.
What was the last one?
Failure to pass a budget.
Failure to pass a budget.
Failure to pass a budget. Pass a budget. Oh yeah. What are the feelings of the experts on that?
So,
yeah.
it seems that the first and third are covered by 4B, which would allow a majority in the Dáil to call for a general election. So if the government can't pass its budget, there's probably a majority against it. And if the government collapses, there's probably a majority against it. So that's what causes those two things to happen. So those two possibilities are caught by 4B, I think. And the failed government formation within 30 days, that's not, but I think that is something that would have to be considered in any system of fixed term parliament regulation. But again, was something that we thought, well, we're not hopefully not trying to design a complete system to deal with all eventualities around fixed term parliament regulations, trying to give a general steer to the Oireachtas as to the sorts of actors that should be involved. That's an issue that would have to be addressed if it goes any further, but not every single issue that has to be addressed in relation to a fixed term scheme for parliaments needs to be the subject of a recommendation today. I think it is an issue that would need to be addressed before it were implemented, but that doesn't mean that we have to vote on it, or that you have to vote on it, beg your pardon.
Robert or John, would you like to add to that?
Well, I just agree with it really, and I just emphasise the fact that this, given that we haven't spent terribly long discussing these particular options, that giving a general, somewhat non-detailed but general picture to the Oireachtas isn't a bad outcome of this, and I think shying away from some of the details is defensible.
Hello, William from Table 4. Look, after the discussion, this may be outside the terms of reference for the Assembly, but I'm going to ask it or propose it anyway. Propose an extra question. In the event that maximum term parliaments, so what we have now, in the event that maximum term parliaments for Dáil Éireann and Seanad Éireann remains, whose approval should be needed for an early general election to be held? And options A, B, C and D as in question 4.
Yeah.
Well,
I think
this is the same discussion. Robert, do you want to?
Yes.
No. Just read the wording again.
So in the event that maximum term parliaments for Dáil Éireann and Seanad Éireann remain, whose approval should be needed for an early general election to be held? And options A, B, C and D as in question 4.
So by maximum you don't mean the 7 years, you mean the 5 years?
5 years.
Yeah.
So maybe I was wondering what's causing, so I'm getting confused, and I was wondering what's causing my confusion. And I think it is maybe the first part of that sentence, because I think it maybe implies that, so a semi-fixed term parliament's been introduced, now what do you want to do? But I think what's happening in question 4 is that if you introduce the cabinet, then you've created a semi-fixed term parliament. If you introduce some majority of, say, an absolute majority of the members, you've created a semi-fixed term parliament. So I think that, I don't think it's a different scenario, so it's not a different situation, if you see what I mean. So, but I think we do need to think about the wording of that question, because it is clearly causing some confusion.
Well, just to clarify, because my colleague asked the question earlier, so is what you're saying then that a semi-fixed term parliament is very similar to what we have, which is maximum term parliaments?
It could be extremely similar, because it could just be, say, the Taoiseach plus the cabinet, but that would still require a constitutional amendment. So it doesn't make the process easy to get to, but you could go through that process and end up at a very similar place to where we are now. However, you could go through a different process, but the same process, constitutional amendment, but actually be in a very different place, because you could have lots and lots of constraints, even though it's not absolutely fixed. Because that range of what constitutes a semi-fixed term parliament is so large, because there's lots of different actors, president, Dáil, cabinet, etc., that could be included in that range of a semi-fixed term parliament.
But I would also, implicit in the way you introduced this was that what we're talking about in that question is not changing the status quo, but changing, in other words, sticking with the maximum, but changing the provisions of the Constitution in relation to how one determines when a new election can be called. And I think it was implicit in what you said that that's beyond the scope of our I was going to say jurisdiction, of our task.
Okay, if it's outside the terms of reference, then it's outside.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't been asked to consider what changes there should be in relation to the current situation, which provides for a maximum term only and not a minimum. Anything else? Wow. We thought it would be much easier, and I mean, I understand, I fully understand and really appreciate all of the suggestions you've made, and we'll just rise and consider them. It's very, very difficult. What we've been endeavouring to do is not to make it too complicated, and to stick within the scope of the task we've been given. So we'll rise and we'll see where we can go.
And just could I say that while we rise, you'll be happy to know that we've reinstated the coffee break, so there'll be coffee available. So we should be back in about 15 minutes.